MODO801 has a lot of new features to get excited about, and the particle system got its own slice of love from the developers. In this tutorial we'll look at Emit on collision. This is a new way to generate particles. Rather than having fixed emitters, we can, as the name suggests, now create particles when objects collide with one another. This is part 11 of the MODO particle system series. Yay! In this episode I'm going to step through the creation of the bouncing ball and crumbling donut scenes. Well, let's start with the basics. We need the ball and the plane. One ball, one plane. I need to make the plane a bit bigger. There, that'll do. And let's move the ball up so that it's going to fall onto the plane. And we need to make these objects into dynamic objects. So bring up the Dynamics tab. The ball will be an active rigid body, and the plane, we will make that into a static rigid body so that it doesn't go anywhere. And already we have something that is going to work as a simulation. Okay, so the ball's not very bouncy. Select the ball and its dynamic properties. Let's increase its bounce somewhat. Let's go crazy and have 80% bounce. Okay, could do with a bit more, I think. Let's not be shy. Let's have 100% bounce. Okay, that will do for now. But we want the ball to be nudged at the beginning of time, and we can do that again by looking at the dynamics and look at impulse. So what we need to do is give the ball a nudge. Let's do it in the Z direction. Let's try 1 Newton. I didn't need to do the N there, it would have done it for me. Oh, that nudges the ball, and okay, we could probably do with a bit more of a nudge. 2 Newtons. Okay, that's more or less what I'm after, I think. Right, so now we're ready to start adding the emit on collision. So how do we do that? So you'll notice a new item in the Dynamics menu, which is emit on collision. So although this is a particle thing, it actually appears in the Dynamics tab. Okay, we can't do anything at the moment. Command disabled. Why is that? Well, it's because we need to select some objects before this will work. If we hover over this button, it'll tell us pretty much what we need to know. So it says, make the last selected item emit particles when it collides with the other selected items. So what I'll do here is I will select the plane and the ball. That means that the ball will emit particles when it collides with the other selected items. In this case, just the plane. And if I click emit on collision, some magic has happened that will cause particles to be emitted on collision. And it's working, but you probably can't see that. So let's look at the particle simulation and make the particles bigger. 10 sounds pretty big, and purple is a nice color. There we go, particles are being emitted on collision. Okay, I didn't really want them flying around like that. How can I fix that? Well, to fix that we need to look at this item, the dynamic collision emitter. That is the thing that is actually doing the emission. And you'll see that it's got a number of channels, a cutoff velocity and inherit velocity. Inherit velocity is the thing we need to stamp on, because what it's doing is it's taking some of the velocity from the ball as it hits the ground and applying that to the particles that are emitted. Now, sometimes that's what you want to do, but in this case we want the particles to stick to the ground. So we'll reduce that to 0 and try again. That's exactly what I want. We've got particles emitted on the ground as the ball hits it. And my cunning plan is that we can then make these particles into emitters in their own right, and they will then emit our sparks. Before going any further, I should probably just mention what the cutoff velocity does. The cutoff velocity controls whether a particle is emitted when one object hits another. If the velocity of the collision is below the cutoff velocity, then no particle will be emitted. If it's above, then a particle will be emitted. Let's have a look and see what has actually been created when we press that magic Emit on Collision button. Let's add in the dynamic collision emitter and expand out all the things that are connected together. Right. Right, so there's a number of things in this scheme. Let's step through it. Right, so we have a solver. This is doing our dynamics, and it's connected to the plane and the sphere. So those are the two items that the solver has to take into account when calculating the dynamics of the scene. But there's some new stuff here that we haven't seen before. The sphere is also connected to this dynamic collision emitter. That means this sphere is going to emit particles when it collides with things, and the particles are communicated to the particle simulation itself, just like all the other emitters, through the operators channel. Now, the sphere will emit particles when it collides with everything plumbed into this channel here, the emit on collision with. And in this case we have a sphere which will emit on collision with the plane. But we could connect any number of other items into this channel. If we look at the sphere's dynamic properties, under the particles section, we'll see that there's a thing called the particle emit group. And in this case, that is just connected up to the plane. But we could connect it up to any group that we have defined, and that's going to be important for our next scene. So remember this layout, because it's going to be important when we come to do the crumbling donut scene. To round this model off, we need to make the trails of the sparks. And we'll do this as a two-stage process in a manner similar to the way that we did firework trails. So what we want to do is take the particles that are generated as the results of the collision and feed them into a new source emitter that will generate the spark particles. So first things first, we need a new simulation, and we need a source emitter connected to that simulation. We'll feed the collision particles into the source emitter, and let's just make these a bit brighter and bigger so that we can see them. And let's run the simulation. Oh, look at that. Okay, but we don't really want these sparks to be generated forever. So that's our first problem. And we can fix that by changing the lifetime of the initial collision particles. Let's turn on cull by age and change it to, say, 3 frames. And then we should just get a quick burst on the collision. And we do. Right, there's something else wrong here. These particles are being generated in all directions. We don't really want them emitting below the plane. There are several things we could do to fix that. We could add an operator to make sure that the particles always go upwards. Or another approach, which is what I'll do here, is I'll add these particles into the dynamic solver so that they bounce off the surface. I guess this is physically realistic. So let's add a dynamic collider, and this has automatically been plumbed into the solver, so our particles should now bounce off the surface and not fly away below it. And indeed that seems to be happening. We could probably do with those particles being a bit more lively, so let's increase their velocity when they're created. 500 millimeters per second. Let's try 1 meter per second. I think that's more the ticket. Okay, but they're all flying up into the sky. We would quite like them to go back towards the ground. So let's add in some gravity. And for these sorts of things, natural gravity is probably a bit excessive. So let's try 1 meter per second squared. So even that's a little bit, possibly a bit too strong. Let's go with that for now. We probably want to cull those particles as well. Let's cull them after, say, 20 frames. And finally, we need to create the trails. And again, we do that by adding another particle simulation and another source emitter. And this source emitter will take the output from the previous one, as you might have expected. But we must make sure these particles don't have any velocity. They want to just get left behind by the leading particle. Let's make them a bit more visible. What color shall we have for these ones? Let's make them red and big. Well, we need to make those particles die after a while as well, so we'll turn cull by age on. And I think we need to have rather more particles emitted to get a solid trail. The last tweak I'll do is I'll change the emit mode to fixed average rate, which will give us rather a more dense trail. Okay, so I think that's more or less there. What we would need to do to render this is maybe connect this particle simulation to a sprite. And you have to balance the density of the sprites against how long you're going to be prepared to wait for the render to happen. Sprites don't render especially quickly if you've got lots and lots on top of one another. So now I think we're ready to move on to the next scene, the crumbling donut. So this is what we're trying to achieve, but what's really happening here? Well, we have a bunch of items, each of which can collide with any other item, and when they collide, a particle is emitted. That particle is then fed into a volume item to give the dust-like effect. Now this sounds as though it might be quite complicated because we don't know which objects are going to collide with which other objects. But we've got a trick up our sleeve. We can use a group of items so that we can specify that all items potentially collide with all other items. Let's see how it works out. So, here we are again, back in the Setup tab. We need to create our models, so very quickly, let's create our ground plane and our torus. The torus I want to rotate, and I'll use Control to do a precise rotation, and I need to resize the ground plane. Job's a good one. Let's just move the torus up. Probably best looking in a front view so that we can get it more precisely aligned with the ground. Right, so we want to break this torus up into bits. And there's this nice new exciting tool called Shatter and Glue that lives in the Dynamics section. Okay, so I happen to know my ideal glue strength for this is 0.02, but your mileage may vary. And I'm going to go with cluster shatter type. There's various different sorts of shattering types that give different looks to the shatter, but let's stick with cluster. And I want to reduce the number of secondary pieces to about 10 because I don't want to have too many pieces. I'm not going to generate a normal map because I'm going to apply subdivision to the objects that are generated to create a nice sort of cracky look to the shards. Okay, and it's done. So we've got our bits and we've got our plane. We need to make these into dynamic items. Well, we've got these selected already, so let's make those into active rigid bodies. Select the plane and make that into a static rigid body. What the Shatter and Glue tool has done is it's created this group containing all of the shards, and it's hidden the original object. In fact, we can delete that now, we don't need it anymore. And while I'm at it, I might as well delete that orphaned mesh item. So this should do something now if we run the simulation. Look at that, falls apart. It's a good one. So let's make these into subdivision surface objects. Let's open the group up. If I select the top item, double click, it selects all of the sub items. I can control click the parent item, just leaving the children selected. So now if I just do a shift tab, I've turned these into sub-D items, which makes them look quite nice. Look, if I do a render, you can see, I think that looks quite attractive. Ultimately, we will change the materials so that the internal material and the external material are the same. Or you can leave them different if you like the appearance. Right, so we want to create some particle action by having these things emit on collision. Now, I'm going to do this by hand this time rather than using this emit on collision operation, and the reason is that I need to do a bit more than what that button will do for me. I need to have all of these items potentially colliding with all the other items and emitting on collision with each other. So where do we go from here? Well, let's start off by dragging these items into our schematic view. Well, there's lots and lots of them, look at that. And they're all connected to the dynamics solver. So far so good. But we need to emit on collision, so we need to add in that dynamic collision emitter. There's another one of the items hiding under this other entry in the Add Items menu. So let's add the dynamic collision emitter. That has been created and has brought in a particle simulation with it, but it doesn't know what items are the sources of the particles. So we need to connect all of these to the dynamic collision emitter. Well, that in the old days would have been a tedious nightmare, but in the brave new world we can select all of those items, hover over to get one of them selected, hold shift down and drag over the thing we want to connect to and connect it to the emission source. The power! So all of those have been connected in one fell swoop. But we still don't know what this emit on collision with needs to be connected to. Well, it could be any one of these shards. So what I'm going to do is create a group. If you remember, in the dynamics properties of our objects, we have in the particles section a particle emit group. So we need to create a group that holds all of these shards. Okay, well that's easy enough to do. Let's select all of those, go into our Groups tab, select New Group, name Shards, from selected items, OK, and this has created a group which contains all of those shards. Well, we're nearly there. Let's bring that group into the schematic, and I'm going to put it over here. I want to connect all of the emit on collision with channels of my shards to the shards group. So in this brave new world, I can select all of those items and then shift, click on the channel, drag and drop. And I've connected all of them together. Right, so the hope is that now when these shards collide with one another, they will emit particles. And just so as we can see them, let's make them big and purple and go. Look at that. Particles, particles everywhere. So it actually did what it was supposed to do. Now, quite a lot of particles there, maybe that's too many. We can reduce the number of particles by adjusting this cutoff velocity. If we make that velocity somewhat larger, say 1 meter per second, then we should get fewer particles emitted. And you can fiddle around until you get the effect that you want. We could do funky things like make these particles into the source of more emission. We can add forces to make the dust swirl around and so on. But I think you get the picture. So that is the crumbling donut. Well, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I'll see you next time.